So I was really curious, what's more important, the camera body or the lens? I currently have two cameras recording me right now. One of these is a camera that I used many years ago and was one of the first cameras I ever got. The other one is the camera that I currently use. And I was curious, if I put an expensive lens on the cheaper camera, and then I put a cheaper lens on the expensive camera, which one would look better? And would the worse lens make the better camera look bad? Or could the better lens make the cheaper camera look good? So what we're going to do now is a blind test. And you're going to be able to watch along and guess which camera you think is which. And then at the end of the video, we'll go through and I'll look at the footage side by side. I'll tell you which shots are which and kind of give my perspective on the results. So currently, I've not filmed any of the B-roll, so this is before. My hypothesis for this is that I think the more expensive camera with the cheaper lens is going to look sharper and crisper, but the cheaper lens or the cheaper camera with the more expensive lens is going to look visually better because of the lens. With all that being said, let's get right into it. Okay, so let me talk about the cameras and the lenses that I'm using for this experiment. So I'm using, for the camera A, is the Blackmagic 6K G2, which is the main camera that I use for all of my stuff. And then the lens I paired it with is the Canon kit lens. It's an 18-55 with a variable aperture, which basically means as you zoom in, the aperture will change. So at 18 millimeters, it can go down to f3.5, and then at 55, I believe it's 5.5, 5.6, somewhere in there. And then the other setup was the Canon Rebel T6i paired with a Sigma 18-35 f1.8 art lens. Currently, this shot you're seeing right now is filmed on my Blackmagic Pocket 6K G2 with the Canon 18-35. The Canon Rebel T6i is technically 1 year older than the camera that I used, but the Canon Rebel T5i is a camera that I owned personally and used for many, many years, and it was absolutely one of my favorite cameras. It had so many features that I loved, the flip out screen, the autofocus. The Canon Rebel T5, T6 is a camera that holds a special place in my heart, and I was just kind of curious as to how well it can hold up today. Looking at the actual footage, let's just get right into it. So there's some things that I noticed right off the bat, and I think the biggest thing is just the quality difference. Now, I don't know, depending on what you're watching this on, if you're watching this on your phone, it might be hard to tell. I tried to color match the shots as much as possible, so these aren't color graded, but they are color corrected. I basically adjusted the exposure and made sure that the colors were as neutral as possible. So these are both in Rec 709, which is a standard color profile, and they're as basically as neutral as they can be, which should help showcase some of the similarities and some of the differences between these two. I didn't use the exact same settings for every shot either, because what I did notice is that at the same settings, and I'll put up some examples, the Canon doesn't look great. Even with the nicer lens, when you would have it at the exact same settings as the kit lens and the pocket, it just doesn't look nearly as good. The pocket kind of blows it out of the water in a lot of ways, which makes sense. This isn't a fair comparison. These are two vastly different cameras. A lot of technology, a lot of advancement between the Rebel and the pocket, and the pocket's much more expensive, so it should have a better image quality. That is not a surprise. Now, what I did find interesting was when I allowed the settings to change and the settings to be different, when I allowed the lens to kind of give the Canon a little bit more of an edge, and I brought down the aperture. So when looking at these shots, we look at this first one, which is very basic, very straight on, super simple. There's a lot of detail in this. This is camera A, or the Blackmagic, and if we kind of zoom in, we can see just how much detail there is in this image. I mean, you can see, individual little pieces of stubble on my skin, all of this detail in here. I mean, it's very sharp, it's very crisp. If we jump over to the Canon, we can see that a lot of that detail is there, but it's nowhere near as clear as the Blackmagic. It's very clear that there is a noticeable difference in quality. Now, the Canon does only shoot in 1080p, and the Blackmagic can shoot in 4K, so that's another difference here. The 4K, the difference between 4K and 1080 is very, very noticeable. But when we look at this next shot, this is where we see kind of the difference between having a nicer lens and just having a nicer camera. So right off the bat, we can see this is the Blackmagic again, and again, a lot of detail in this shot, very crisp. You can get detail in the skin, detail in the eyes, lots of detail in here, and we lose a lot of that in the Canon. But when we look at it at the full image, this is a shot where I would prefer the look of the Canon, because the f-stop on that kit lens is 4.5, and I think I had it zoomed in, so it might have even been 5.5, 5.6, somewhere in there. And so while there is some depth of field, because obviously the subject's really close, the background's decently far away, it's nowhere near the look that I'm getting with the Sigma lens, where there's just so much more bokeh. The background is way more blurred. It looks a lot more aesthetically pleasing, even though you're giving up a lot of resolution and a lot of sharpness. This shot is way clearer and it looks a lot crisper, but this shot looks a lot more aesthetically pleasing. This shot, again, great detail from the Blackmagic, really crisp, really sharp image, but again, we're not getting a ton of depth here. I mean, the background is out of focus, but it's not crazy. When we look at the Canon, it looks a lot nicer. There's a lot more depth of field, and the image overall, again, just looks more aesthetically pleasing. This just kind of goes to show that there are scenarios where having the better lens is ultimately going to give you a better looking image. Now, when we look at a wide shot, this is an example of kind of the opposite of that, where having a higher resolution camera is going to give you a better image. Because when we look at this wide shot here, I mean, the details in these trees, in the ground, in this person walking along the street, there's so much that you can see here. And when we switch over to the Canon, we lose a lot of that detail, and it doesn't look nearly as sharp as the Blackmagic, kind of as you would expect. Again, it's 1080p versus 4K. There's going to be a difference in overall image quality. This is a scenario where you are taking away all of the advantages of having that nicer lens, because when you're shooting out in the daytime and your aperture's f10, f11, well, having the 4K image versus the 1080p image, that's going to show up. It's going to be very, very clear because the lenses are essentially neutralized, if that makes sense. Both of them are going to be shooting at f11. Most lenses at f11 are just going to look sharp. And so when you're comparing a 4K camera versus a 1080p camera, the resolution difference is really going to show. Now, this is one that kind of surprised me. So this one is the Blackmagic, and it looks solid, nothing too crazy. And then this one is the Canon. And honestly, this was the one that looked the closest to me. This is one where even the extra resolution didn't really change the overall look of the image. Yes, technically it's probably sharper and there's probably less noise in this image, but to an almost unnoticeable degree. Now, where the Canon really falls off is in two categories: dynamic range and low light. And this last example, I think, was the perfect showcase of that. So, as we can see here, this is the Blackmagic, right? We've got kind of a low light scene with a little bit of light coming from this window and then most of the light coming from this monitor. And there's a fair bit of noise in this shot. I won't lie. There's a good amount of noise in it. It's not the cleanest image, but overall it looks pretty good. We've even got a little bit of detail out here when we can see these trees and some of the sky. But when we look at the Canon, it gets a little bad. I can't lie. So the sky here, and I will admit the angle is a little bit different, so you can see a little bit more of the trees just because the angle is a little bit higher on the Blackmagic. But the sky is completely blown out, and it's even darker inside. So even though the exposure is so high that we're losing detail in the sky, it's still not enough to bring up more detail in the shadows. And this is where dynamic range comes into play. Dynamic range is essentially the range of light that your camera can see. So basically from the darkest part of the image to the brightest part of the image, how much of that can the camera see? Blackmagic has a lot of dynamic range. And so that allows it to see more in the dark and more in the light at the same time. And if we look down at these scopes, perfect way to visualize and see this. If we look at the top of the scopes here, we can see that it's up here. It's pretty high up, but it is not clipping. It's not hitting the top of the scopes over here. And then if we look at, kind of these shaded areas, they're sitting a little bit under. They're a little bit low for my liking, but they're still pretty good. And then if we look at the Canon image, we can see something a little bit interesting. If we look at the tops of these, it's a flat line. It's just a straight flat line. And what that means is the image is clipped and there's no information. Basically, it's hit a ceiling and there's no more information above that, and that's why you get this hard line at the top. And you're also getting that at the bottom of the image. There's this hard line, this hard cutoff at the bottom of the image that's showing you there's no information there. When we flip back to the Blackmagic, you can see that there's still information there, and there's this nice subtle kind of roll-off in these highlights that's showing that there's still detail there, there's still information there in the image. And the shadows do still get a little bit crushed, and it's not, again, the dynamic range on this camera is amazing, but it's not infinite. There is, a range to it, obviously. But it's much better than the Canon, and this is a big showcase of where camera technology has come in the last 5-10 years. The amount of dynamic range in cameras these days is insane compared to older cameras. When we look at this close-up, this is one where I think the lens struggles a bit on the Blackmagic. Because I zoomed in on this shot, the aperture went down, and in a situation like this where it's a low light situation, you kind of end up losing valuable light that you kind of need. So you end up getting more noise, and the image just looks more underexposed. And if you zoom in, you can see just tons of noise in this image. Now, I do think I could clean this up and then make it look really good, and it already looks pretty solid. But obviously, the variable aperture kind of ruins the image a little bit in that sense. Then we look at the Canon, and while the exposure is higher, we're running into the exact same problem. So when I try to expose for my face here, I completely blow out the sky, and we can see that again, that flat top where it's just crushed. There's no information there. The highlights are blown out, and you've got nothing to work with. And in a situation like this, I have to expose for my face. And so if that means that this gets blown out, that's kind of just something you have to deal with, because this is the part of the image that you want to be properly exposed. Whereas with the Blackmagic, we kind of can get the best of both worlds. I can expose for my face. It's a little bit dark. I would like to bring it up a little bit, but I didn't miss out on the information out here in the sky, and it doesn't clip, and it just looks overall much, much better. Now, one thing I want to do real quick is show the unedited versions of these videos, because I think that's also a fair thing to look at. So if you look at this first clip, this is the Blackmagic, and this is what it looks like without any editing. It's very flat, it's very dull, there's very little color in it, and it takes a lot of work to get the image to look decent. And so there's a lot of work that goes into just getting it to look normal and getting it to look, usable. Whereas with the Canon here, this is also unedited, but we can see there's already contrast, there's already color, there's already a lot going on with this image. From my perspective, I don't like this. I don't like when the camera has a lot of color baked into the image, because it means I can do less with the image. There's less for me to work with. Whereas when I'm working with this, right, a very flat image, a very bland image with not a lot of color, I'm able to add in a lot of the color. I'm able to add in all of the style to it because there's nothing to it to start with. Whereas with an image like this, I'm already starting with a lot of color, a lot of contrast, a lot of stuff going on. And most cameras nowadays have a log profile or a very flat, neutral profile. But with the T6, this was the best that I could get. This is as flat as I could get it, and it's already got a lot going on. Now, comparing an old Canon camera to a Blackmagic camera when looking at color and like how much you can edit it is a completely unfair comparison. The Blackmagic is one of, again, I'm very biased here, but one of the best cameras when it comes to producing a flat, neutral-looking image. Again, this is one thing that maybe for you, for someone who's not trying to color grade their footage a whole lot and wants a better image straight out of the camera, this could be something that's good for you and something that you like. If I was doing YouTube content and I'm just vlogging, or I'm just trying to make talking head videos or stuff that's, again, not as artistic, but more just making quick, fun content for YouTube that doesn't require intensive color grading and all of the stuff that comes with a more, cinema style camera, this could be good. So what all this boils down to is essentially just the camera that you buy, the lenses that you buy for it, everything that goes into your filmmaking kit should be tailored to what you need. Do you need autofocus? Do you need a flip-out screen? Do you need a smaller, more portable camera? Do you want to be able to color grade your footage? What type of content are you making? All of these things are questions that you can ask yourself to decide what camera is right for you or what lenses are right for you. And ultimately, it's whatever you want. Whatever camera you can afford, whatever camera fits your needs the best, that's going to be the best camera for you. With that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye for now.